So, when you go about ordinary life, you never think about whether you're conscious or unconscious. It's only if something was to go wrong and you suffered a blow or you have to undergo anesthesia that the issue of being unconscious or arises. Otherwise, we just experience our being as we never give it a second thought. But what I'm going to ask you to do is to give it a second thought and to think about how is it, what's going on that makes it seem like all the lights are on and somebody's home and you're tuned in and you're experiencing and knowing, and how does it work? How do you get that feeling? Where does that feeling come from? And the thing that's quite amazing about this is that feeling is all coming from your body and your brain, and of course from the external world that you are interacting with, either through vision or sound or all of the other senses that we have, touch, smell, and so on. So I'm just going to briefly review again a way to try to understand what's going on, how we get that feeling of all the lights are on and we're conscious, and what it means for that to go away and the lights are all off because you're unconscious. So this is a picture. These are not bones. This is a picture of a human being with the major nerve pathways. So all of these nerve pathways which thread through your body, and this is just the major ones. There's another whole constellation of fine scale nerves. These are the major nerves, and they all are aiming and heading for and going up that spinal cord and into the brainstem, because the brain is really a very key focal point of our whole monitoring and control of the body, as well as for where we get this feeling of consciousness. So I'm going to focus on the brain, and these are actual scans that have been done with various kinds of techniques that actually reveal a lot of where the nerve fibers are going. And the important thing to get a sense of is that this brain is enormously rich in nerves. It's very intricately connected. And that was a kind of large-scale picture. If we focus in, what we see are that each of these nerves consists of a nerve body with these dendrites that go out, and they're looking to touch and to get signals from other nerves, and this major axon that goes out will fire signals when an appropriate combination of signals come in from the other nerves. Now, what I'm trying to do is lay the groundwork here for how the brain is going to know something about itself. So all of these nerves that we were just looking at here, what are they doing? They make a network that's very much like a computer network or any kind of digital storage medium. It doesn't have to be digital, it could be an analog storage, but a storage medium that can store information. That means that what's in our brains is not just nerves. The nerves are actually the medium on which is written, on which resides something quite beyond the nerves. So I want to illustrate that with a DVD. So if you look at a DVD, it's kind of a piece of plastic, but it's got a way in which a laser will write little tracks of on and off. So where you see the hole corresponds to an off, and where you see the solid part corresponds to an on, and a laser will put those pits in from whatever it is that wants to be inscribed on the DVD, and then another laser can read what's on there by sending a laser beam in and having it bounce back either with an on or off. So all of this is all about on and off, on and off, on and off, and different combinations of on and off. So amazingly enough, will get you in a little tiny disc like this, will get you Laurence Olivier starring as Richard III in Shakespeare's play Richard III on DVD. And this is the famous scene in which Richard is thrown from his horse and has that great line where he says, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. And this is Laurence Olivier. And that is what's on that plastic disc. And now you're looking at that picture of Laurence Olivier, and now what was on that plastic disc is now partly in your brain. It got off the plastic disc, it got onto the screen here, and now you have been looking at it, and it came in through your eyes, went through the optic nerve of your eyes to the back of your brain, and it actually crossed, the optic nerves actually crossed to get to the back of the brain, and there it entered what's called the visual cortex, which is where all of your vision gets connected to the rest of the brain. And so now Laurence Olivier is over here in this network. So, back to the whole network here, the brain and nervous system has 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion synapses. Those are the little on-off when the neurons touch each other and go on and off. A DVD has 50 billion bits. So you can get the whole Shakespeare play with 50 billion bits. But the brain and nervous system is over here at 100 trillion synapses. So you see that not only the human brain, but many animal brains have enormous memory and processing power. And it doesn't just have to be Laurence Olivier. Anything can go into this brain. This happens to be a picture of the Dalai Lama. I just wanted to put in another picture. Now that's in your brain as well. So what I want to do is briefly review from last time how this consciousness comes into being. And I'm going to use a movie making and movie watching metaphor. So if we're going to make a movie, we got a subject, and we have a movie production team here. I'm calling it the Neural Movie Company because I'm going to put it in the brain in a minute. And it's got vision and sound. And we have, of course, got vision and sound are two of our primary inputs into our brains. And it also has other sensory inputs, but I'll just leave it with vision and sound. And out here, out in the world, for the eyes and the ears and all the other senses, is the subject. And inside the movie company is a library where you can put the things that you've recorded, and you can also work on them and manipulate them and edit them. And there's a director also that tries to say what we're going to put the camera on, what we're going to put the sound on. So this actually is not very distant from how we are actually operating with our visual and auditory capacity. That's what we're doing. We're kind of like a little movie company in there, and it goes into our memory, and we can actually stash things in memory. So here's the Neural Movie Company, and now I want to think of it as being inside the brain, so that now here's the brain, just represented by the box here, and outside the body and the brain is the external world. And here's the subject that the Neural Movie Company is trying to make a movie of. And there are many other parts of the brain that do other things, but we're not interested in. So now I want you to think about the fact that there's that the brain can have several movie companies inside. There's enough capacity to do that. So we have another one here. And what we're going to do, what the brain is doing, is replacing the subject out here and vision and eyes, the camera and the sound. We're going to instead just have neural visuals and neural sound, which means the vision and sound are replaced by direct neural wiring to the library, the first movie company. The first one is the one that has your eyes attached to it and is looking at the subject and recording it. But these guys are looking at the making of the movie. They are recording how this movie is getting made. And the subject of the movie is the making of a movie. So there is a part of your brain that has the capacity to monitor, in effect, make a movie of what the other parts of your brain are doing. This is the brain monitoring itself. So now we're going to call this the conscious neural network. And we have neural visuals and neural sound, which are actually coming from inside the brain. And it too can store things. It too can direct its attention to one thing or another. So consciousness is the activity of the brain observing itself, observe the body and the world. So that's what's giving the sense of being on, of being observant, of watching what's happening. That is the gist of consciousness. And just as a nice note about this, it's a way to also understand why we have problems about reality and fantasy. Because we can also make neural movies of all kinds. Once we've brought in things from the external world, real things from the external world, and stored them in the brain, we can work on those stored things rather than what was out in the external world. So we can make fantasy neural movies. We do this with imagination and storytelling. It's a very important part of human capacity, is to tell stories and to imaginatively conceive of things that may not necessarily be real. So one of the things we're doing with our fantasy neural movies, with our imaginations, our storytelling imaginations, is we took in trees, people, rocks, waterfalls, all kinds of scenes through the direct neural inputs from our senses. But once they're inside, we can look at them directly. We don't have to look at what's out there. And the fantasy neural movie doesn't pay much attention to what's directly out there. It doesn't even have access to it because it doesn't have eyes. It has to go up here through the visual and audio part of the brain. So we can do things like make angels. It's very easy. We know what people are like. We know what wings are like. We stick wings on people, and there we have angels. No problem. We do that all the time. We have this great capacity. All right. So that's a review of somewhat from last time. But now we want to move on and try to understand subconscious parts of the brain. Because the conscious part of the brain is only working, its activity comprises about 5% of the activity of what our brains are doing. So 95% of what our brains are doing does not involve anything that we're consciously aware of. I'll explain that's not quite accurate because the unconscious body-brain combination can bring up into parts of the neural networks of the brain signals which consciousness may not be aware of at that time, but can come back as it sweeps through the brain and pick them up. So there's a way in which we really need to think about conscious and subconscious as being very intimately connected and working together, even though what's going on down here may not be conscious up here at all times. So the conscious brain becomes aware of interaction with the subconscious after the fact, because if it's unconscious, it's not conscious. But by that trick of the ability to lay, it's like you put something on the floor over there that I don't see, and it's in the you're my unconscious. So you put something on the floor that I didn't see, and I'm not conscious of it. And then, oops, there it is. I saw it, and now I am conscious of something that the unconscious brought to me. So this is the kind of ways the conscious and unconscious can interact. So now what I want to illustrate are some really quite amazing things about how our conscious and unconscious mind works. How about making a decision? And make it something as simple as picking up a cup of coffee or whatever you're drinking and taking it to your lips like you just did. Now, you made a decision to do that. What's amazing about this is we think that, first of all, if you were unconscious, you would not have done that. And you would think that now that you're conscious, and we are conscious, if you're going to take a cup to your lips, you've got to be conscious, that it all involves consciousness. Here's what is very confounding and very mysterious. Making a decision employs the conscious brain, yes, but the decision begins in the subconscious brain. And here is a very famous experiment that was done in the late 1980s by a man named Beebit. Here's how the experiment goes. Imagine that you're looking at a clock face, and the hand is just slowly going around the clock. So there, like you see right here. So this hand is slowly just going around the clock, and your brain is covered with electrode sensors, and because that can localize what's going on in different parts of the brain. And we know where the motor cortex in the brain is. I don't know where it is exactly, but the neuroscientists who work on this do. So the motor cortex and the nerve system that's related to getting your finger to push a button, those are known places. And when they're activated and a so-called action potential rises in the brain, it can be measured. So the brain is going to be able to signal through these electrodes when it's going to start moving the finger to push the button. So the idea of this experiment is the hand is continuously rotating. It's not going too fast. It's going about at the speed I'm showing it there. And you just arbitrarily pick a point where you want to press that button. And you press the button, and you read the time at which you press the button. So here it's looks like it's just a little before the 5, and the person who's doing the subject of the experiment says the clock hand was at position 4. Well, let's see what the electrodes were saying. So here is the button push got pushed right here. The note that the hand was at position 4 was almost at the same place. But for almost a second, more like half a second before, the finger was already in the brain. The motor cortex was already getting ready to push that button. But the conscious mind didn't see it until this point. So this says that the conscious and unconscious really have to be thought of as working together. In a minute, we'll talk about some of the implications of this, of some people who interpret this as saying, well, we don't have free will. The unconscious is running things. Consciousness doesn't seem to be in charge. It seems crazy. And that's not really a very correct way to look at it. But people still are debating this experiment now, some 20 odd years, almost 30 years later, and it's still a very controversial set of experiments that are repeated over and over again, and they keep coming out this way. So making a decision, something we think is pretty important and is part of our autonomy, is I decide to do this, and you've got to be conscious, it's a conscious thing. Well, there's a way in which the unconscious part of your brain and body is also playing a big role here, and is having making the first step, taking the first step. So we shouldn't think of conscious and subconscious so separate and divided. So here's the consciousness up here, it's completely clear and wide open, and it's the 5%, and down here is the dark subconscious. This is not a correct way to think about it. We should think of it more graded and more of a kind of set of interactions. Now, down here, if I put you under anesthetic, or you get a blow on the head, or you are really unconscious, down here we really go completely dark, obviously. But between this completely dark and the full light of day of consciousness, there are gray regions that exist. And parsing that out is kind of an important modern topic of research. It's not very well done yet. Parsing out those interactions between the conscious and unconscious is still a very big unknown. So I thought the next thing that would be interesting to talk about your unconscious and how it is your friend, is in problem solving. I think Lisa referred to that, and many of you know that when you are fussing about something and trying to solve a problem, maybe solve a problem about what kind of stitch pattern is not working out right with the knitting, and you want to figure out how to do it a way in which it will work, and you can't seem to bring together all the pieces that need to go into it. And a math problem. Sometimes when you're working on math problems, you're well advised to put it down. And if you play the violin, go play the violin for a little bit, or the piano or something. Go read a poem or two, or just go out, get some fresh air. Do something else. There are more experiments that are being done along these lines, that when their conscious mind is elsewhere, they're now on to something else. That problem that was back there that they were originally working on consciously is somehow in the background still being worked on. And I've experienced this quite a bit myself. In fact, my big challenge to myself is to let it go. Because often when I'm working on a problem, I don't like to let it go if it's in a state of it's not resolved. I want to keep working on it, worrying it. And actually, you're well advised to put it aside. Or have 2 or 3 things you're working on. Put that one aside, go work on another one that's stalled. And when that one stalls, go to something else. So there's obviously the subconscious is at work behind the conscious mind doing problem solving. Another important thing about the subconscious and the conscious is the conscious brain, our conscious brain, evolved to be quite capable of deception and lying. It comes as part of being human. We are capable of deception. And not only are we capable of deceiving others, we're capable of deceiving ourselves. We can trick ourselves. Lo and behold, the subconscious brain seems to record the truth or the reality. So the reality of the situation that you may be involved in is sitting in your subconscious, but the conscious brain, which you think that's the one that should be really not confused or deceptive or distorting reality. If it's conscious, it should be the really real. No, it's the other way around. The conscious brain actually is very clever about how to deceive and how to lie. So here's a test that sort of reveals this. Self-deception test. So here's how this test goes. We have a group of people, and we're going to pair people off. So people are going to be in pairs. And what's going to go on here is choosing easy and hard tasks. So we're going to have a hard task, and we're going to have an easy task. And people are going to be in pairs. So we have two partners and two tasks. The easy task is like looking at a photography book or an art book where you're just going to look through pretty pictures. And the subjects are told, we're going to ask you some questions after you do that. So that's one of our tasks, is look through the art books, and then we'll ask you some questions about the pictures that you saw. The other task is we want you to solve math problems for 45 minutes. And we're going to ask you some questions about the math problems that you solved. So the first task that people have to do is decide who's going to, in the partners, who's going to take which task. So we give the partners, or each person is given a choice. You can choose one of the tasks yourself. You pick it out. Or you can turn it over to a random number generator. So the random number generator will just come up with either do the picture book or do the math. And you'll just live with whatever it comes up with. And there are computer algorithms to just randomly pick. So let a random number generator choose the task for you. Most all of the participants in these tests choose the easy task and skip the random number generator. So then when we get done looking at the pictures and doing all the math problems, people are then brought to have a questionnaire. They have to answer a questionnaire. And the questionnaire has really been designed to have certain probing questions slipped in among the questions, like what were the colors in some of the pictures, or was there a quadratic equation in the math problems you were working on, or who was the photographer that took. So there are all these questions. But then as you're going through all these questions about colors and photography and square roots and all, a little question will come up. Did you allocate the tasks fairly? And most people answer yes. Did others allocate the tasks fairly? And people say no, they didn't. And if you, as a separate kind of thing, give a disinterested third party a look at these results, they weren't participating in the test. The disinterested third party will say, no, you didn't allocate the task fairly to all of those who chose the easy task. So there was no confusion about which tasks were easy and which were hard. And what's interesting is that the participants did, in fact, know very clearly that others picked easy tasks. So the participants knew that others were not fair. Did the participants know that they themselves were not fair? So now we have a test to see if they knew they were not fair. And the way this test works is we're going to have the people go through and do the questionnaire, but we're going to give them a 7-digit number, like 253-7297, an ordinary, like a telephone number. And then we're going to ask people that when you go to answer all these questions about the square roots and the colors of the photographs of the photographers and so on, you need to keep that in your mind. 253-79977. So people are trying to hold that in their mind while they're answering that same questionnaire. So what that does is it ties up consciousness. So the consciousness is tied up trying to hold those 7 digits in mind. And now those little questions slip in. Did you rate the task? Did you choose the tasks fairly? And people, when they're trying to do that, they say no. And in other words, they respond just like the disinterested third party. And so they rate themselves as unfair as the others who chose easy. So we hold the truth in our subconscious, while our conscious mind is self-deceived. And this has been repeated quite frequently. This is not a fluke. But this is not surprising, because the human brain, given our evolutionary history as social creatures, in which the give and take in social situations, the politics of life, is absolutely fundamental for a very social species like ourselves. And in the politics of the give and take of life, the brain evolved the capacity for success in dealing with that kind of give and take to get the most you can by giving. And give, don't unnecessarily give things that you don't have to give, or pay price for costs, or work that you could get something with less. So the brain, and it takes a lot to do that. It also means that you also have to know who you can trust, who you have done favors for example, and then they're going to do favors for you because we remember those things. And that takes brain power. It takes brain power to remember that and to remember who is who and who's in the social hierarchy. So the conscious mind is very preoccupied with those kinds of things. So it's not surprising that the conscious mind is where self-deception is, including where you self-deceive yourself. And that is the best kind of lying. It's the best kind of self-deception. Because when you believe the lie, you don't have to cover. You don't have to remember who you told it to and who you didn't tell it to, or how you have to change the details of a situation that you were trying to recreate that's false. That's not the way things happened at all. If you really believe it, you just believe it, and you don't worry about the fact that it's a lie. Now there's a positive side to that that I would like to mention, which is when we have this kind of competitive social behavior that involves some kinds of self-deception, the best thing, there's an evolutionary drive, because when you try to deceive, first of all, other people are good at detecting it. And so the capacity has evolved to detect deception. And then you get to be a better deceiver. But then the detector gets better and better. And there's an argument that can be made that what this evolves towards, finally, is a kind of transparent truthfulness for all, that there's no advantage to deception, because your best thing is to really be generous. Don't fake it. Don't fake your generosity because you want it to look good. but you really didn't put $50 in the collection box or whatever, put the $50 and that's the best thing. And it's successful. It's true. Okay, but what I think is really interesting here is the truth and reality are more in our subconscious than they are in the conscious mind, which is very surprising to most people. Now we can say something about personal responsibility in the law. If the subconscious is such an important part of how the brain and mind work, if that's where decisions begin to be made, where do we come out on the business of responsibility, personal responsibility? And a whole lot of lawyers for the last 20 years have really gotten into studying neuroscience. These are defense lawyers for the most part. Now maybe prosecutors are now also studying it too. But you probably heard this little kind of mantra, my brain made me do it, or my unconscious made me do it. I'm not responsible. Now, the first thing we want to, this is a very complicated, well, it's not complicated, but it's a vexing subject. It's a very vexing subject. The first thing we should be aware of is brain pathology certainly has to be a part of personal responsibility in the law. And I want to mention a famous case. This is a young man, his name is Charles Whitman. In 1964, he went up into the Texas, at the University of Texas, he went up into a clock tower. He was he was an ex-Marine in his fatigues with lots of weapons and ammunition, and he started shooting people, and he shot almost 20 people before he himself was shot. He was autopsied, and it was found that he had a cancerous tumor on the amygdala of his brain, which is, the amygdala is a very important, if you've been to some of my previous lectures, you know that that's a very important of the limbic or emotional system that controls our emotional behavior. And he was showing signs of some erratic behavior to his friends and family in the weeks leading up to this event. So brain pathology is certainly a consideration in any kind of legal proceeding about when somebody like Charles Whitman has done something that is destructive and hurtful to the society. Well, now we come to what about personality disorders? What about things that are really a kind of pathology? And here what we get into is start to get into a murky situation where what's normal and what's pathological. And we know, for example, that I should tell you that there's been I can't remember his name right now, but there was a neuroscientist who took upon himself to put a fMRI scanner on a trailer and to traverse the country going to the prisons that had men on death row. And what he wanted to do was look at the brains of the people on death row. And not just on death row, but who had done pretty horrific crimes. And what he found was that they were perfectly capable of understanding the difference between right and wrong, which is the McNaughton rule that we still kind of inherited from the 19th century about when somebody is culpable for some kind of criminal act. Did they know the difference between right and wrong? And for the most part, these criminals do know the difference between right and wrong. They can argue very carefully. They're smart. Not all of them. Some of them have very low functioning intelligence. But they don't have any emotional affect. They lack emotional affect. They lack a kind of sense of looking at your face and seeing that you are in a state of unhappiness, or that you're slightly pensive, or most human beings have a capacity to kind of read a face or read body language to know when somebody is upset or when somebody is feeling free and happy. These criminals are not very good at that. And they are not very good at controlling their emotional. There's like a disconnect of the things that would inhibit you from attacking another person and hurting them. They don't seem to have those controls. So, beyond personality disorders, the little mantra, my subconscious made me do it, is really so simple-minded I wish I hadn't written it there, because it's more about our ability to control our emotional behavior than about subconscious or conscious. And I put the question marks in here, how we as a society can decide when things are simply bad behavior or when there in fact is a malfunction, a pathology. And even if there is a pathology, this still raises difficult questions about the legal system. For example, there's a lot, or more than just a little, neuroscience that shows that there's a way in which you can't change certain behaviors that people have because the mental equipment they have is pretty well set. Not necessarily all behaviors by any means, but some, and particularly in these rather horrific cases where people behave so antisocially. Chop up bodies and put them in bags and bury them in their backyards or leave them in a closet or things of that sort. That there's something about that that's kind of incurable. But we also don't know enough about it yet. But it does raise the question, are we willing to then lock up people, deprive them of their freedom, and keep them locked up for the rest of their lives because they're a danger to other people and a danger to themselves? It's a difficult question. And one that obviously is very topical at the moment. Lots of people in the legal and political world are thinking seriously about this. Oh, okay. We've come to the end. All right. So we're going to end there with this tour of the subconscious and the way it interacts with the conscious mind, and we can now have some questions or comments or observations.
Is cognitive dissonance...
Try and speak a little louder than you normally would, so people can hear you.
There's this thing called cognitive dissonance when what you're doing and what you actually believe, when they're different, we experience this psychological tension. And I was just wondering, because the consciousness can lie and the subconsciousness cannot, I wonder if that's part of the fueling behind cognitive dissonance. So if I in my subconscious knows that smoking is not healthy for me, but in my conscious mind, I convince myself that, nobody else in my family, nothing's happened to them, and I'm fine, I'm not going to go there, then I can go outside and smoke my cigarette, or wherever, I guess, if I were smoke my cigarette without worrying about that, because I've deceived myself. And I wonder if that self-deception is what's behind, some of the causes of cognitive dissonance. Because the only way to fix it is to change how what you're believing or change what you're doing.
No, I think it is. I think it is. We are going to have conflicts in our behavior, in decisions that we have to make, and so on. And they can shade, they can be conflicts that are completely rational, where maybe it's not so much about smoking, but whether you should try to lose weight or things of that sort, and the problems that that induces, or whether you should take certain drugs which have side effects. So maybe that's not such a great thing, but the drug does solve another problem. So we constantly have to balance things like that. But where this starts to really get to this cognitive dissonance aspect is when we start to touch on things in which our self-interest is getting pitted against the self-interest of others. Then we always want to cut the pie in our favor.
Yeah,
Yes?
Something I've thought about for a period of time. And when I walk into a room and I watch something on TV, all of a sudden it's something violent. And I look at it and it catches my attention and I'm engaged looking at it. And then I'll turn around and leave and do something else. I wonder what happens. Is that ever going to come back to haunt me? And in my subconscious mind, or my conscious mind, wherever this is that it's residing, is it aware? Am I aware that this was not my reality? That it was. Are you following what I'm saying?
I am. Mm-hmm.
Is it not my reality? How do I know for sure that this is not my reality?
Because you didn't seek it out, I guess is what you're saying. You just had to.
Yeah,
it came to you. You didn't come to it. So, but you nonetheless got it. So you have to live with it.
Yeah.
But of course, there are lots of things in life that we didn't ask for that we have to live with. This is a really difficult and I think still very unresolved area. And it's tricky. For example, one of the things that's related to this, you said it was a violent program, is the whole issue about violent film, violent games, violent artificial life. And does it have an effect on people's behavior in natural life? Of course, the people who make video games and make violent movies say, no, it's just a movie, it's just a game. And then there are others who say, no, it's not. It actually can, the simplest way of thinking about it is it hardens people. It makes people desensitized. They're not sensitive. For many years, I thought that the violence and the video game, especially in the video games and the first-person shooters and so on, and the sexual violence, was just horrific and was an abomination and just a terrible direction for a society to be going in. And one day I happened to be thinking about this, and it suddenly occurred to me, we evolved, especially males, to acquire females, taking them violently from other males in other tribes and raiding them. And violent raiding is built into the human genome, or at least the underlying brain and emotional structures that can support that are built in. And it's possible that we could have evolved in a slightly different way that could have ridden on the same underlying biology, same underlying brain. Didn't have to be all that violent, but it had the connections that would permit it. But it also got shaped by a very violent past. We are the inheritors of a very violent we're very violent animals. But we've had going on 80 years without a world war. This is unprecedented in human history. If you came to my talk on the evolution of civil society and the decline of violence, when you really look at it, step back and not just look at the attack on the Twin Towers or the war in Iraq or the war in Syria right now, but stand back and look at violence throughout human history, it was just much more horrific than the present. So here's the funny thought I had. Oh, we have turned violence into virtual violence, virtual reality, so these young boys and young men don't have to do it in real reality. They can just do it virtually. And all of that pressure and energy that's built in and ready to go to war gets lived out in the PlayStation or whatever they are. There was a very funny cartoon that came out, this was many years ago, this was during the Reagan administration when Reagan had the U.S. invade Grenada. Does anybody remember that?
Yeah.
So the cartoon, what's his name? There was a great cartoonist of that era, whose name suddenly escapes me. Had a wonderful cartoon, and this was like early 80s, but the simple video games were already out then. There were little simple video games you could play, and they were kind of like more like pinball machines just about. And so you see this guy on a field phone, and he's got a helmet on, and his buddy's right next to him, and in one half of the panel, and the other half there's Reagan in his pajamas on the phone, and the guy is saying, "Yes, sir, Mr. President, we're right here, and we're really giving it to him." And the guys are playing the video games. Yes.
Have you heard any of the research that as far as the video games go, where before the video games got to the level they're at, they really had to work hard to get the soldiers to make the kill shot, and that now with the desensitization that's, the training that's essentially going on with the video games, that they don't have to train them as thoroughly because they will make that kill shot.
I wasn't aware of that, but I'll tell you why that's, I think, quite a good point and why it's relevant here. And it runs against my observation that maybe the video games are good because they provide a non-destructive way of dealing with the way males are wired up. There's a lot of very famous experiments that show that if you do something with some intermediary separation with another human being, the famous problem is the trolley problem. You've probably heard me talk about that before, in which there's an out-of-control trolley coming down the track, and there are 5 workers on the track, and if the trolley's not stopped, it's going to kill them all. But there's a switch, and you're at the switch, and you can throw the switch and switch it off that track and save those 5 people. The only problem is there's some person working on the side track, and he'll be killed. So the question is it morally acceptable to do that? And this has been tested on people of all religions, all genders, cultures all over the world. And by and large, people say, well, you don't want to kill anybody, but if you have to, yes, because you're going to save 5 people, that's okay. If you present the exact same situation now, trolley out of control, 5 people working on the track, and now there's no side track, but you're up on a bridge, and there's a big fat man on the bridge with you, and if you push him off and he falls in the track, the trolley's going to hit him and derail. And of course it will kill him, but the 5 people will be saved. Same deal as kill 1, save 5. The same thing all over the world, different religions, different men and women all say, you can't do that. So there's something about physically touching, hurting someone that we are emotionally programmed for from our evolutionary history that holds us back. But now, if you've got these guys in goggles and you never see the enemy. It's just a laser beam. That inhibitory effect is not going to be there. And I gave a talk on this. If you would like to look at this in more detail, look at the video that's posted on my website from about a year and a half ago. It's about free will. And I can't remember the exact title of it, but if you run down, it's about a year and a half back, and you'll run into it. I use as an illustration there something that wasn't even quite as high tech. If you look at the modern airplanes, it's not like back in when air warfare first started and you saw these pilots with their helmets in the cockpit and it was all open air and they're shooting machine guns at each other. It's all high tech, it's all electronic, and these kinds of sophisticated weapons existed during the time of the Vietnam War, and there was an attack on a village in the Vietnam War in which napalm was dropped on the villagers, and there's a very famous picture that was taken of a young Vietnamese girl running naked with her body on fire, and from that napalm attack. But if you look at the cockpit of the airplane, you don't see a girl who is playing with her brother or working in the field that you're now going to drop the napalm on. Or you're going to take the napalm and you're going to throw it in her face. You don't see that. It's just impersonal. And that's very worrisome. And as I say, it runs counter to my hope that maybe virtual reality would take away all of these now maladaptive characteristics that male animals still have and siphon them off and neutralize them. But that, you raised a very good point. Yes?
You say that conscious mind can self-deceive you, and your conscious mind can deceive you, and your subconscious tells the truth. Okay.
Roughly.
All right. That's what I'm getting at. Memories. If you recall things that didn't actually happen, is that a case of your subconscious not telling you the truth? Like people are prompted, to say they were molested, and turns out they were not, or things like that. I have distinct memories of an event, and somebody else insists that never happened, and I don't know who's right. So, is your subconscious capable of deceiving you in these false memories, or how do they fit in? How does memory fit into the conscious?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way I'd like to answer it is to go back to this slide, in which inside our brains we have the capacity to make things up. And it obviously is going to involve both consciousness and unconsciousness, but consciousness predominantly. So when we make things up, they're made up. And it's not surprising that because we do have this capacity, that's one of the things about this amazing brain, is it not only takes in the outside world, it can create a new inside world with the things that it took in from the outside world. And so there is a problem about reality and fantasy. And I would say that that's a general problem that's not pivoting on consciousness and unconsciousness. Because if you hold in your unconscious a fantasy, it's possible that you don't remember that it was a fantasy. The conscious deceit or the conscious self-deception is where you know you're lying. Yes.
Where does the data in our subconscious originate? Does it originate just within myself, or can some of it have been passed to me? Where does that data originate, that information?
Well, I am, until somebody can show how there is some other mechanism of information that flows from us, into us, among us, that doesn't involve the senses. I have to say that that's how we get what's in us from the outside world, is through our senses. And I don't think there's any, well, that's once our sensory systems get going. But remember, we inherit the whole capacity of our genetics and our body. That didn't come through the senses. In fact, what it is going to create a sensory system that then will start taking things from the outside world, like the first thing that child might do once it emerges in birth is to take that nipple. So, and now that's a very sensory thing, but the programming for that was inherited from previous generations and previous animals. Yes?
Like being afraid of snakes. We don't typically learn to be afraid of snakes.
Oh,
We
no.
just are.
No. So, I think maybe, Sarah, a more general question you're asking, is there some non-physical information presence that can just fly through the air and put something in your brain without your senses and without any physical activity? I think that's the question you're asking.
Not so much fly through, certainly I don't think fly through the air. I think probably more in terms of perhaps something that's passed down, some type of cosmic energy, but maybe that's through the genetics that you referenced. Maybe that's how you would see that. But I think that there is some type of consciousness, or I guess subconsciousness, and maybe that's why I said data or information. I think there is data or and information that is present sometimes in me, that was present at some other time, some other person, and there was no transmission or way of knowing that. So I think maybe I'm like
This is not unique to you. I mean, most of the world believes this. Most of the world believes in spiritual transmission. I'm not sure it's quite the same as what you were talking about, but I think it would be compatible.
I don't think of it in terms of spiritual, but some people might.
Well, or immaterial.
I think so.
Well, this gets back to that DVD and Richard III. The DVD is the material medium, but Richard III is not the DVD. And that's true of all of the things that are inside in our flesh, in our fleshy brains. Those things are not material. They are not the neurons. But yet, they need a medium to be present. They need a place to be encoded. And the brain, that wet, warm brain with all of those nerve cells, is where all of these thoughts, music, literature, that's where they come together. And we don't have a lot of experience and capacity to appreciate how utterly amazing that is. That in this wet, bowl of pudding is such another world that is really quite different from it, and is not. It's only dependent upon it to exist at this particular time and place in this particular individual. But otherwise, it can fly through the air. Yes?
Would you say that we have overlooked a whole layer of complexity here in terms of what comes through our senses and gets stored? And that layer of complexity is interpretation, construction. A perception is hugely judgmental. For example, I'm driving down the road at twilight, and I see what distinctly appears to be a dead animal alongside the road. I take it to be a dead animal, no question. I remember it as a dead animal alongside the road. And I remember it. If someone asked me if I saw something unusual alongside, yeah, I saw a very large dead animal. Well, upon investigation, perhaps it's discovered that it's an article of lost clothing, a rumpled jacket alongside the road. So what gets stored in our memory is clearly not just a visual impression, it's a whole set of judgments and expectations, interpretations.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, when we remember something complicated, an important event where perhaps a murder has taken place, what we're really doing is not remembering what occurred to us or what we saw, but reconstructing, creating a story based on some fragmentary memories of people and noises, and things that were said. Does this complexify this picture a little bit of memory and perception, data, storage?
Sure. I think that's an appropriate point to make. I think that one way to look at it is all of these individual observations. You see the lump on the side of the road, and maybe you thought of it as an animal, and closer inspection showed it was coat. We can make mistakes. That's very common, and for the most part, our quick judgments get it generally right. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to drive home tonight. You'd end up in a crash. You wouldn't know where you were exactly. Our visual system and our brains are constantly making default assumptions about what it is we're seeing and what it is we're doing. And for the most part, they're right. But they're not always right. And in fact, that's how optical illusions work. Optical illusions work by taking advantage of the way we're wired up for certain default assumptions. Now, on the larger issue of whether anything out there that we're perceiving is real, or all that we're dealing with are the images that come through our eyes and our ears and our senses, that's all we know. We don't really know if anything out there is real. I find that not a very compelling argument, because we have a network of many observations, many individuals, many kinds of instruments, many kinds of different angles, different perspectives. And it's like if you just had one thread or another thread crossing, then I would say maybe we don't really know much of anything about what's happening. But reality is like this really complicated fabric with many, many threads of many, many people and many observations. And even at the scientific level, scientific observations that pull these threads and verify them and review them and recategorize them, so that this fabric is getting, the fabric of reality is getting woven, and there are places in which we really have just a very sparse set of threads, and there are other places where the threads are very thick and rich and hold a very compelling picture of what it is that what our existence is and what we're doing. Yes.
Are you saying that if 15 people saw it and 14 of them said it was a coat, and the 15th one thought it might be an animal, that the fact that a lot of different people are observing it, that it is likely in reality a coat?
I would say that would tend to have some weight. I would give some weight to that. I don't know how much weight I'd give to it, but if two people make an observation and they disagree, I'd be kind of not sure what to do. If 2,000 people make an observation and 1,999 of them conclude it was a coat and only one of them thinks it's an animal, I think we'd probably think it was.
And so you're thinking maybe in reality there really is a coat out there, that we're not just making it up.
No, it had all the cues that made you think it was a coat, but it was not. It wasn't enough. There was still an aura of ambiguity about it. Wasn't clearly a coat, or it wasn't clearly an animal. It could kind of go either way. But closer inspection could bring the truth of exactly what it is.
Like when we're driving along and perceive things, we're basing it on the information that's already stored in our library. And so, like I was driving on one road and I saw where it looked like it's kind of like stuff that's already stored in our library, just like his movie reference. And so I was driving on this road and I thought I saw a bear cub on the side of the road, and I kind of flinched, and then when I got closer it was just a stump. But that's just because, you know, your brain kind of compares, like it looks at something, it's like, ooh, that looks like this, it looks like that, it looks like this, and tells you very quickly, like so quick we don't even know it's happening, to tell us.
There could be even other cues, such as when a truck dumped a load of peanuts up at Lover's Leap and the bears were constantly coming around. So you would think, oh, it must be the bear. I'm not saying that was your situation, but there are other things we use as cues about what it might be. Yes?
I'd like to relate this subconscious to dreaming. I
To
just recently
dreaming?
watched a NOVA thing about what are dreams, and they're doing a lot of research on that, and now they're thinking that a lot of their reason for dreams is it's your brain putting things together and helping you learn. And you know, they would do some experiments where you would try to learn how to say ski or something, and then if you slept and the next day you actually, your skills in skiing had improved if you were allowed to dream, but not so if you only rested and weren't allowed to sleep or dream, or if they woke you up and disturbed your dreaming. And so they're thinking that the dreaming, something going on in your subconscious, is helping you get better at skiing.
I think that's true. Yes.
It's REM sleep. When you go into REM sleep, that's when your memories are actually getting encoded. And it's very important part of sleep and dreams.
Well, I guess we will stop and have some refreshments. Thank you.
Thank you.